On September 14th, 1967, a man named Curtis Ray Hollins walked out of San Quentin State Prison carrying a paper bag with everything he owned inside it. 2 shirts, one white, one grey, both folded with the mechanical precision of a man who had shared a 6x9 cell for 4,000 days and learned that the only territory you control is the space between your pillow and your folded clothes. A Bible his mother had mailed him in 1962. The spine cracked at Psalms because that was the book she had underlined, and Curtis read her underlines more than he read the words. He used to press his thumb against the ink and wonder if her hand had rested in the same spot. A photograph of a woman named Delia, who had written every week for the first 4 years, then every month, then every other month, then not at all. The last letter was postmarked June 1963. He kept the photograph anyway, not because he still loved her, because the photograph was proof that someone had once loved him, and inside San Quentin, proof was more valuable than the thing itself. And 2 fists that had not lost a fight in 11 years. He was 6'3", 230 pounds. His shoulders had been assembled by pulling industrial laundry carts down concrete corridors and by doing push-ups on a cell floor every morning before the 5 a.m., count 200 push-ups every day for 11 years, which means Curtis Ray Hollins did the math once and stopped counting at 800,000. His knuckles were deformed, the right hand especially. The middle knuckle rose from the metacarpal like a small ridge of mountain, the bone broken and refused at an angle, because he had set it himself using the steel edge of his bunk frame and a strip of torn bedsheet, and there was no one in San Quentin who would look at that knuckle and not understand what it meant. It meant this man hits things that don't move out of the way. 46 fights, not sanctioned, not refereed, not recorded anywhere except in the bodies of the men who lost them and the memory of the men who watched. Fought in the laundry room where the steam was so thick it tasted like bleach and your feet slipped on wet concrete. In the shower block at 3 a.m. when the night guard was asleep, or paid enough to pretend. Behind the kitchen loading dock during the 6 a.m. shift change, a 4-minute window when no officer had sight lines, and 4 minutes was more than Curtis ever needed. 46 fights, and not one man had put Curtis Ray Hollins on his back. He was about to meet someone who weighed 135 pounds, and nothing he had learned in 11 years, not the violence, not the survival, not the instinct that had kept him breathing inside a place designed to make breathing difficult, would prepare him for what that small man was about to do. But before we get there, we need to go back one night, because what happened in that park the next day didn't begin with a punch. It began with a ceiling. September 13th, 1967. The night before release, North Block, San Quentin. Curtis lay on his bunk, staring at a ceiling. He knew the way other men know their wife's face. Every crack, every water stain, every chip of paint that had been peeling since Kennedy was alive. The ceiling was the last thing he saw every night and the first thing he saw every morning, and somewhere in the middle of year 7, he had stopped seeing it as a ceiling and started seeing it as a clock. Not because it changed, because he changed beneath it. And the ceiling measured the distance. He was 41 years old. He had entered this place at 30, a longshoreman, a Golden Glove semi-finalist, 1954 Bay Area tournament, lost in the semis to a kid from Stockton who was faster and lighter, and in those days the judges liked speed over power, which was the last time Curtis Hollins would let someone else's preference determine the outcome of a fight. Before the docks, before the gloves, before any of it, a kid from West Oakland who learned to fight the way every kid in that neighborhood learned, not in a gym, on the walk home, by necessity, by repetition, by the understanding that if you couldn't keep yourself upright between the school door and your mother's front porch, the world would lay you down, and the world would not feel sorry about it. The thing that put him in San Quentin was a man named Arthur Perkins, fellow longshoreman. The dispute was over Delia. Curtis found out on a Tuesday, came home from the night shift, and found a matchbook from a restaurant he'd never taken Delia to, and the matchbook smelled like a cologne Curtis didn't own. By Wednesday afternoon, Arthur Perkins was in Oakland General Hospital with a fractured orbital bone, a dislocated jaw, 4 broken ribs, and a ruptured spleen. The fight lasted less than a minute. It took place in the parking lot of the 7th Street Terminal in full view of 11 dock workers, none of whom tried to intervene, because what they were watching was not a fight in any sense. They recognized. It was a demolition. The judge at sentencing used a phrase that Curtis carried with him into his cell and never set down: the most savage use of human hands this court has witnessed in 12 years of service. 11 years for aggravated assault. He served every single day, not one day reduced for good behavior, because Curtis Hollins did not have good behavior. He had survival behavior, and inside San Quentin, those were two different currencies that bought two different things. Inside, he found out what he really was. The docs had hinted at it. The golden gloves had circled around it, but San Quentin confirmed it with the clarity of a medical diagnosis. Curtis Ray Hollins was built for damage, not the way a trained fighter is built, disciplined, calibrated, governed by cornermen and bell counts and the gentleman's agreement that both men will walk away at the end. Built the way a natural event is built, the way a flood doesn't negotiate with the riverbank. His fights weren't tactical, they were environmental. When Curtis hit a man, the people watching said the sound was different from other fights. Not the padded thud of a gym, something deeper, structural, the sound of load-bearing parts failing. His most feared weapon was the left hook to the body, a punch that started somewhere near his back pocket and arrived at the rib cage with the rotational force of his entire frame, 230 pounds moving through a hip that had been rehearsing this motion since he was 12 years old on the walk home from school. Men who absorbed that punch didn't fall the way fighters fall in movies, backward, dramatic, cinematic. They folded, inward, like a chair being closed. The air left them and the architecture collapsed, and they went down, making a sound that wasn't a scream and wasn't a groan. It was the sound a body makes when it has been informed, at the level of its organs, that the fight is over. His most talked about fight was against Gerald G. Thompson. Thompson was from Compton. He had killed 2 men before the age of 20. He carried himself through the yard with the particular stillness of someone who had permanently crossed a line. The rest of the population was still standing behind. Thompson didn't fight like a boxer. He fought like a man who had decided that rules were a theory he didn't subscribe to. He bit, he gouged, he used his forehead as a third fist. He would grab your ears and try to tear them from your head if you let him get close enough. The fight took place behind the laundry building on a Monday morning. Steam in the air, bleach on the floor, a circle of 14 men who had each paid half a pack of cigarettes to watch. It lasted 37 seconds. Curtis slipped Thompson's first wild right, stepped inside, and delivered the left hook to the body. 3 of Thompson's ribs cracked on impact. Curtis's own knuckle, the middle knuckle of his right hand, fractured against the bone. He didn't notice until the next morning when he couldn't make a fist. He set it himself. Bunk frame, bed sheet, no infirmary. In San Quentin, you did not go to the infirmary for a broken knuckle. You went to the infirmary when you could no longer stand, and sometimes not even then. 46 fights, 46 men who learned something about the weight of Curtis Hollins's hands that they would carry in their ribs and their jaws and their sleep for the rest of their lives. And now it was over. Tomorrow morning, out the gate, done. But here is the thing that nobody, not the parole board, not the discharge officer, not the counselor who spent 11 minutes preparing Curtis for re-entry into a world that had been spinning without him for 4,000 days, nobody told Curtis the one truth that every man who walks out of San Quentin eventually discovers on his own. The day you walk out, you are nobody. Your name doesn't carry. The streets don't know your record, the reputation you spent a decade building, the thing that kept you alive, that made men step to the side when you walked the chow line, that meant you could close your eyes at night without calculating the odds of opening them again, stays behind the wall. It does not fit through the gate. It does not ride the greyhound with you. It stays in the north block with the crack in the ceiling, and some other man will lie beneath it tonight, and the ceiling will begin measuring him instead. Curtis walked out at 7:14 in the morning. The bus took him 31 miles south to the Oakland Greyhound station on San Pablo Avenue. He had $63 in gate money. He had no address. He had no one waiting. He sat inside the station for 2 hours, watching the departure board cycle through destinations he couldn't afford, eating nothing, saying nothing, occupying a plastic chair with the specific stillness of a man who has been institutionalized long enough that freedom feels like a room with no walls, and no walls feels like falling. And while Curtis Hollins sat in that bus station learning that the world had not paused for him, 8 miles east, in a garage behind a house on Monticello Avenue, a man who weighed almost 100 pounds less than Curtis was doing, something that would have confused him deeply. Bruce Lee was teaching a student how to hit without making a fist. The garage belonged to James Yim Lee, a welder, martial artist, and Bruce's close friend, 15 years his senior. It was narrow, hot, barely wide enough for two men to work through a technique without hitting each other or the walls. A wooden dummy was bolted to one side. A heavy bag hung from a ceiling beam that Bruce had to duck under when he demonstrated high kicks. A stack of books sat on a folding chair. Krishnamurti, Alan Watts, the Tao Te Ching, a copy of Hemingway's The Old Man and the Sea, that Bruce had read 4 times because he said Hemingway understood economy of motion better than most martial artists. The floor was poured concrete with no mat. Bruce did not believe in mats. He said mats teach your body that the ground is soft, and the ground is never soft. Bruce Lee was 26 years old, 135 pounds. He had been living in Oakland for 3 years, running a small martial arts operation that rarely held more than a dozen students. He drove a used Chevrolet. He supplemented the school's income with private lessons, actors, businessmen, a philosophy professor from Berkeley who wanted to understand Chinese thought through physical movement rather than text. Hollywood had already crushed his first serious dream. The television series Kung Fu, which Bruce had conceived, developed, pitched, and essentially built from the skeleton of his own philosophy, had been handed to David Carradine. A white actor would play a half-Chinese Shaolin monk on network television. Bruce had been told in the polished language of executive rejection that American audiences were not ready for an Asian leading man. Those words, not ready, sat in Bruce Lee's chest like a stone that would not dissolve and would not pass. Linda would later say that in the fall of 1967, Bruce trained harder, moved faster, and smiled less than at any other point in their marriage. Something was coiling in him, tightening. He was searching for something in his training that he could not name, and the fact that he could not name it made him push harder. On that Wednesday, September 14th, the same morning Curtis Hollins walked out of San Quentin. Bruce decided to take 4 of his students to Lincoln Square Park in Oakland's Chinatown for an outdoor session. He did this when the garage felt like a coffin, when he needed open sky above him and room to demonstrate the full arc of a technique without ducking the beam. Lincoln Square was a small park bordered by low brick buildings, a cracked basketball court, a few benches occupied by elderly Chinese men who played chess and watched the world at a speed they could manage. It was just past noon, September in Oakland, 72 degrees, a salt and diesel breeze moving in from the bay, the kind of light that makes shadows sharp and everything look like it's posing for a photograph it doesn't know is being taken. Bruce wore a white t-shirt, dark trousers, no shoes. He never wore shoes on grass. He said he needed to feel the earth through his soles, the way a blind man reads with his fingertips. He was demonstrating the straight lead punch, Jik Chong Chui, the technique that would become the foundation of everything he was building, toward what he would soon call Jeet Kune Do, the way of the intercepting fist. The punch appeared simple, a straight line from the body to the target, but it required the entire kinetic chain to fire in precise sequence: rear foot into the ground, hip rotation, shoulder extension, wrist snap into alignment, all compressed into a single motion, so fast that the eye could not separate its phases. You did not watch the punch travel. You saw the hand in one place, and then it was in another, and the distance between those two places was something your brain refused to process as movement. His students were trying. They were not succeeding. Bruce was patient, but his patience had a quality that James Yee, the young student he was working with most closely that day, described as a silence that made your mistakes louder. The afternoon was calm, the park was quiet, 4 students, 1 teacher, grass under bare feet, a punch being refined, 1 millimeter at a time, and then a voice from behind them, low, flat, carrying no question mark and no apology. That doesn't work on real fighters. Bruce did not turn around. His students did, all 4 of them. What they saw was a man who made the park feel like a smaller room. Curtis Hollins stood 15 feet away, arms folded across a bare chest beneath an open denim jacket, wearing prison-issue boots that were a half size too small because they were the only pair the discharge office had. The paper bag sat at his feet. He had been watching for almost 10 minutes. He had wandered here from the Greyhound station with no plan, found the park because it was near a neighborhood he half recognized from a life that felt like it belonged to someone else, and was sitting on a bench eating a gas station ham sandwich, his first chosen meal in 11 years, when he noticed the small Chinese man throwing punches at the air, and then he noticed 4 younger men watching the small Chinese man throw punches at the air, and then he noticed the younger men trying to copy the motion and failing, and something stirred in Curtis Hollins that he hadn't felt in a long time. Not anger, not aggression, annoyance. Because Curtis had seen this before. Inside, there was always some inmate who claimed karate, claimed kung fu, claimed some ancient secret technique that made him untouchable. Curtis had fought 3 of them over the years. They lasted about as long as the others. They could perform forms that looked like art. They could not absorb a right hand to the jaw and remember their own name. So when he watched Bruce Lee throw punches at empty air in a public park, teaching boys to do the same, he said what he was thinking, not to start something, just because 11 years behind concrete had stripped away every polite mechanism that tells a civilized person to keep quiet when they see something they believe is a lie. Bruce turned, slowly, and he did not look at Curtis the way people usually look at large men. Upward, assessing size, calculating threat. Bruce Lee looked at Curtis the way an architect looks at a building, starting at the foundation, the feet, the way the weight distributed over the hips, the angle of the shoulders relative to the ground. He read the structure before he acknowledged the face. "You fight?" Bruce asked. "I fought." Curtis's voice was flat as a slab. 46 times. Win? All of them. James Yee later said, "The silence that followed those 3 words lasted 30 seconds. It probably lasted 5. But inside that silence, something happened to Bruce Lee's body. Not tension, not the coiling you see in a man preparing for confrontation. Something subtler, a settling, the way a bird of prey adjusts its weight on a branch, not preparing to fly, but preparing to see. "Where?" Bruce asked. "San Quentin, bare-knuckle. There's no other kind in there." Bruce's eyes moved down to Curtis's hands. The crooked mountain range of the right knuckle, the white scar lattice across the left, hands that had been used as weapons so frequently and so violently that the bone had physically remodeled itself around the job, the way a tree grows around, a wire left in its bark for long enough. Bruce looked at those hands for what felt like a very long time. Then he looked back up at Curtis's face. "Show me," he said, and what happened next changed both of their lives. But to understand what Bruce Lee did in the next 3 seconds, and why a 230-pound man who had never lost a fight stood completely still afterward, unable to speak, unable to move, staring at his own fist as if it had betrayed him. You need to understand something about Bruce Lee in September of 1967 that almost nobody talks about. You need to understand what he was looking for, and why the man standing in front of him, a convicted felon with deformed knuckles and prison boots that didn't fit, was the closest thing to an answer Bruce Lee had found in 3 years. That part of the story is next. And I promise you, what Curtis Hollins saw in those 3 seconds is something he carried for the rest of his life. Because he had spent 11 years believing he understood what a human body could do. He was wrong. Curtis stepped forward. He didn't raise his hands. He didn't assume a stance. He just walked into the space Bruce's students had cleared and threw a right hand at the air. Not at Bruce. At nothing. A demonstration. But even as a demonstration, the punch told its autobiography. It was fast, not beautiful, not textbook, but fast the way a car wreck is fast. It started low, near the hip, and travelled in a slight upward arc that said this fist had been born in rooms where you couldn't fully extend your arm. Laundry rooms, shower stalls, the narrow corridor between a bunk and a concrete wall. It was a punch that had learned to navigate obstacles, to find the jaw around a forearm, to arrive at the temple despite the elbow blocking the path. It was a punch that had been educated by architecture. Bruce watched, arms at his sides, breathing through his nose, completely still. Curtis threw 2 more, a jab, short, more piston than whip, designed to measure distance and establish authority. A cross, heavier, with a drop of the rear shoulder that added a layer of gravitational force most trainers spend years trying to teach. Then something that wasn't boxing at all, a looping overhand forearm strike that swept forward and downward like a man swinging an axe at a low branch. It was a prison technique, invented for the moment when your opponent covers his skull with both hands, and you need a tool that treats the guard itself as the target. No boxing coach teaches that punch. San Quentin teaches it every day. Again, Bruce said, slower. Curtis looked at him. A frown crossed his face. Not anger, confusion. Nobody in San Quentin had ever asked him to go slower. Slower was charity. Slower was giving the other man a window. You did not donate windows, you boarded them shut. Slower, Bruce repeated. I want to see where the weight goes when the fist leaves. Curtis threw the right hand again, half speed, and as it extended, as the knuckles moved through the air at a pace that was, for Curtis Hollins, practically a courtesy, Bruce Lee moved. What happened next lasted less than 3 seconds. James Ye said those 3 seconds took apart everything he thought he knew about fighting and reassembled it in a shape he didn't recognize. As Curtis's fist traveled forward, Bruce stepped not backward, not to the side, forward, directly into the path of the punch, closing the distance rather than creating it. His left hand met the inside of Curtis's forearm, not as a block, not as a grab, as a suggestion, the lightest contact, a fingertip pressure on the inner wrist that changed the punch's trajectory by approximately 3 inches, just enough for the fist to slide past Bruce's right ear, close enough that Curtis could feel the heat of Bruce's skin against his knuckles, but connecting with nothing except the air behind Bruce's head. In the same motion, and James Ye said this is the part he has replayed in his mind every week for decades, Bruce's right hand was already at Curtis's throat, not striking, resting, the fingertips placed against the Adam's apple, with the pressure you'd use to check whether a peach is ripe, gentle, almost medical, and absolutely lethal in its implication, because the fingers were resting on the windpipe of a man who had just thrown a punch and missed, which meant the fingers had arrived at their destination before the punch had finished failing. Curtis froze, not from fear. Curtis Hollins knew fear the way a sailor knows weather. It was a condition he had lived inside so many times it no longer surprised him. This was something else. This was the sensation of a law breaking, not a legal law, a physical law, a law Curtis had spent 41 years relying on. That size determines outcome, that speed is proportional to mass, that a smaller man cannot move faster than a larger man's fist. That law had just been proven wrong, and the proof was 5 fingertips resting on his throat. That, Bruce said quietly, is what works on real fighters. He removed his hand, stepped back, stood with his arms at his sides the way he had been standing before, relaxed, centered, breathing normally, as if nothing had happened, as if time had briefly rearranged itself and then returned to its previous shape without leaving evidence. Curtis stood with his arms still extended. James Ye later described him as looking like a man who had reached for a door handle and discovered the door wasn't there. This is the moment where most stories would give you the fight. The big man charges, the small man counters. Somebody ends up on the ground. The audience gets the collision they were promised. That is not what Curtis Hollins did. And the reason he didn't do it is the reason this story has survived for almost 60 years while thousands of fight stories have been forgotten. Curtis lowered his arm. He looked at Bruce. His jaw was moving, not clenching, not grinding, but working. Chewing on something that had no taste and no texture, but was too large to swallow. Do it again, he said. A request, not a challenge. The voice of a man who needs to see the impossible, repeated before he can accept that it happened the first time. Throw it at full speed, Bruce said. The student stopped breathing. James Ye stepped backward without deciding to. The mathematics were obvious to everyone. A right hand at full speed from a man who had knocked out 46 opponents with bare knuckles, connecting with a man who weighed 135 pounds, would not result in a knockdown. It would result in a reconstruction. Curtis set his feet, and for the first time since he had walked over, his body organized itself into something that was not casual. Not a boxing stance, not a fighting stance from any school. The stance of a body that had fought 46 times on concrete and tile and wet laundry room floors, and knew without being taught, without a single hour of formal instruction, exactly how to arrange 230 pounds for the maximum transfer of force from the earth, through the skeleton, and into whatever was standing in front of it. He threw the right hand, full speed, full intent. Bruce shifted. The movement was so small that from 10 feet away you would have said he hadn't moved at all, but the punch, which had been aimed at the exact center of Bruce Lee's face, passed through empty space, through the place where Bruce's head had been 1/10 of 1 second earlier, and as it passed, Bruce's left hand caught Curtis's wrist. Not grabbed, caught, the way you catch a bird without closing your fist, and Bruce's right hand delivered a short, precise strike to the inside of Curtis's elbow, to the spot where the ulnar nerve passes closest to the surface, unprotected by muscle, unshielded by fat, a target the size of a quarter. Curtis's arm died. There is no other word for it. It stopped receiving signals. It went limp from the elbow down, and the hand that had broken Gerald Thompson's ribs, that had fractured its own knuckles against human bone, that had not failed its owner in 46 consecutive fights. That hand hung at the end of a dead arm like a glove on a string. Curtis staggered. His body followed the dead limb sideways, pulled off balance by an arm that had suddenly become cargo instead of equipment. 2 seconds. The arm was dead for 2 seconds. Then it came back, tingling, heavy, confused but operational. Bruce was standing 4 feet away, hands at his sides, breathing normally. Curtis flexed his fingers, opened the fist, closed it. The arm worked, but his face had been rebuilt. Every expression he had carried into the park, the boredom, the contempt, the prison yard certainty that martial arts was theater and fighting was fact had been removed and replaced with something James Yee described simply as the look of a man who just found out he's been living in the wrong world. And then Curtis Hollins did the thing that breaks me every time I tell this story. He sat down, on the grass. He lowered himself slowly, not collapsing, not falling, but choosing the ground. He put his hands on his knees. He looked at the dirt between his shoes, and he said, in a voice that was no longer flat, no longer hard, no longer armored, a voice that sounded like it was coming from somewhere much younger and much more frightened than the man sitting on the grass in Lincoln Square Park. I've been fighting my whole life, and I never learned a single thing about it. Bruce walked over. He did not stand above Curtis. He did not crouch. He sat down across from him on the grass, cross-legged, knees almost touching, like two boys in a schoolyard, like two monks in a temple, like two men who had just discovered that the other one carried the missing half of something neither of them could complete alone. You learned how to survive, Bruce said. That is not nothing. That is the foundation. Without it, everything I do is theory. It's not what you just did to me. What I just did was built on top of what you already have. Survival first, refinement second. You mastered one. I mastered the other. Neither of us is finished. Curtis looked up. What are you missing? What are you missing? I have never had to survive the way you survived. I fought in Hong Kong on rooftops in alleys after school, but I always had a door to close behind me, a home, a teacher, a mother who yelled. You had nothing. You fought inside a cage where the price of losing was not a bruise. That kind of knowledge lives in the body. I cannot learn it from a book. I cannot learn it from a wooden dummy in a garage. He paused. And I want it. Bruce asked Curtis to hit him. Not a demonstration, a real body shot, full power. Curtis refused, not because he feared hurting Bruce, but because he had felt the fingertips on his throat and the nerve strike on his elbow, and he understood, with the clarity of a man whose business is violence, that the person sitting across from him operated on a level his 11 years had not prepared him for. Bruce insisted. Curtis set a condition, body only, not the face. Curtis threw the left hook, the rib breaker, the fight ender, the punch that had folded Gerald Thompson in 37 seconds. It landed flush on Bruce Lee's midsection. The sound it made was James Yee's exact word, wooden. Not the thud of flesh on flesh, the crack of bone meeting something that should not have been that hard. Bruce absorbed it. 3-inch shift to the right, feet planted, face unchanged. He asked for another. Curtis threw it again. Same result. Then Bruce put his hand on the spot where both punches had landed and said, Your power comes from your back, not your arm. You rotate from the lumbar spine. Most boxers rotate from the shoulder. That's why your hook carries more mass than your mechanics should allow. Your body solved the physics without your mind ever writing the equation. Curtis stared at him. Nobody has ever told me that. Nobody needed to. Your body learned it because the alternative was losing. That is the purest education that exists. They talked for 2 hours on the grass. Curtis described how he read a man's intentions through the feet, not the eyes. How the neck muscles contract a full second before the fist moves. Bruce described interception, entering the gap between a man's decision and his action. They discovered they were speaking the same language in different dialects. At some point, Curtis said something that Bruce Lee would repeat for the rest of his life, to Danny Nosanto, to James Lee, To Linda, every man I fought wanted to win. You don't want to win. You want to understand. That's why I couldn't touch you. I was fighting. You were reading. Bruce offered Curtis a spot in his training group. Free, no conditions. Tuesday and Thursday evenings. Curtis came for 11 weeks. Then he stopped. Not because of Bruce. The parole board required steady employment. The only job he could find was night shift at a warehouse in Richmond. The hours conflicted. Bruce offered to change the schedule. Curtis said no. He said he had one chance to stay out of San Quentin, and he would not hand anyone a reason to send him back. They shook hands on the sidewalk outside the garage. On a Tuesday in late November 1967, James Ye said Bruce held the handshake longer than he had ever seen Bruce hold a handshake. When Curtis walked away, Bruce stood in the doorway watching the empty street for several minutes. When he came back inside, he said one thing: "That man knows more about fighting than anyone I have ever met, and he has no idea." 6 years later, Bruce Lee was dead. 7 months after that, Dan Inosanto received a letter at his academy in Los Angeles. Lined paper, blocky handwriting pressed hard enough to dent the page. Return address, a rooming house in Oakland. I heard your teacher passed. I only knew him 11 weeks. He changed my life in a way that 11 years inside could not. He taught me that strength was not what I believed it was. Please tell his wife the man from the park is sorry he stopped coming. I was afraid I was too small a part of his story to remember. Curtis R. Hollins. Dan showed the letter to Linda Lee. She read it twice. Then she told Dan something Curtis never learned. Bruce had mentioned him by name, multiple times. In conversations about training, about the gap between theory and survival, about what a body knows that a mind cannot teach. Bruce had told Linda, "I met a man in a park in Oakland who spent 11 years proving the body already knows how to fight. Everything I teach is just helping the mind get out of the way." He understood that before I did. He just never had the words. Linda asked Dan to write back. He did. The letter was returned 3 weeks later. Red stamp, no longer at this address, no forwarding. Nobody knows what became of Curtis Ray Hollins. Oakland records list the name through 1976. After that, nothing. He never returned to San Quentin. He never contacted the Lee family. He never enrolled in another martial arts school. 46 fights, undefeated. One afternoon in Lincoln Square Park, changed. He was released on a Tuesday. He found Bruce Lee on a Wednesday. By Thursday, both of them were different men, but only one of them became famous for it. The other wrote a single letter, mailed it to the only thread connecting him to the man who had truly seen him, and the letter came back stamped with 3 words colder than any punch: Curtis Hollins ever threw. No forwarding address. Sometimes the most important people in a legend's life never make it into the books. They show up on a Wednesday, say something so true it rearranges the furniture inside another man's mind, and disappear before anyone thinks to write it down. The strongest man in the room is not always the one still standing. Sometimes he is the one willing to sit down.